It is Friday, October 25th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another Black Ops episode of LTPS. We actually got a lot to go over. There's a ton of stories piling up, so let's begin, as always, with a very brief reminder for the PS Plus Essential October lineup. Claim those games before they go away. And also going into our first news story, we have a brand new PS5 System Software Update 10.20, which we touched on this a little bit in our most recent conversation about activity cards and how they don't skip splash screens and logos anymore and things like that. There's really no new info in here because the one little patch note, or rather change log item on the most recent firmware, was that they've made some changes to how activities display in progress, not started or completed, depending on whether you have started or completed those activities. Also saying potential spoilers will still be hidden, which is still very much the case. They're just kind of rearranging how they display, what they display, when they display, which in the grand scheme of things, I think most people probably would not notice those changes, but it is still one of those things where I think we can safely conclude it was rather intentional that the way that language around cards has now changed from no longer resuming or starting activities, but rather resuming or playing a brand new game. They're all cold starts. Cards no longer jump around various different portions of a game, which, as we've said many times over, developers were not really supporting them anyway, so more often than not, the behavior wasn't really consistent. Having said that, this most recent firmware is now out there, and it's a very minor change, and that's really the only thing in there of note, outside of improving stability and also the usability on some screens. Moving on to our next news story, let's talk about PlayStation Stars, because two very big changes going on right now. You probably noticed yesterday that you did have to agree to new terms of service if you tried to use PS Stars, which should not be too surprising because they did outline that change back in August, where starting October 24th is when you would have to agree to new terms, and that's where they're going to limit how you earn points on PS Stars, so you can no longer earn points from game subscriptions on PSN, including re-upping your Plus subscription, and also points expire after a year now instead of 2 years. So that's the one big change, but really the worst news here happened even before the new TOS went out, which is some people are reporting and saying that they no longer have the option to redeem wallet funds on PSN. However, there actually is a slight difference here because it would seem as though maybe Sony is doing some A/B testing. So for my experience, I have no option. I cannot redeem any wallet funds on PlayStation Stars. Some people are saying that they have the option for $10, but now they can no longer redeem $5 or $25. Some are saying they can see $10 and $25, and I think some are saying that they only have the $25 option. So it's either it's a bug or it is a lot of like regional A/B testing and Sony trying to figure out what they're willing to continue paying for the service, because this still is, no matter how limiting it might end up being, it is still a rewards program that Sony is spending money on actively, because there is a certain percentage you are getting back when you spend on PSN. Obviously bogus that after a year Sony has been making more and more limitations, but they've got a year of telemetry to now look back on and think, okay, here's how the program's going, here's what we're spending, now we'll make some adjustments from there, and guaranteed it's not going to go up per se in your favor, so that's sort of where we are right now. But it definitely sucks that in some cases, mine including, like no option to redeem wallet funds. That is pretty annoying. I mean, I can see why they might want to up the minimum to let's say 10 or 25, because that's the kind of behavior they want to encourage, is you spending more on PSN to try and earn those wallet funds. But that's what we got so far. I will say this though, still a lot of misinformation about wallet funds and how you redeem on PS Stars. It's still not always like a 100% better option to redeem wallet funds. In most cases, it obviously is, because the wallet funds mean you can buy anything on PSN versus the handful of game redemptions on PS Stars. But God, it's just such bad advice when people say, always redeem that. Not necessarily. If it's a new game that just came out, if it is available for redemption, if you want to play it right then and there, and you live somewhere with local tax, then redeem it that way. You're skipping over tax. If you redeem wallet funds to buy the same game, you actually did just spend more money because you have to cover tax with the wallet funds. So sometimes, depending on the circumstance, it is better to redeem the game. I don't know, it drives me nuts when I keep seeing this advice. It's bad advice. Just make sure that it's not available to redeem and you don't want to play it right then and there. Otherwise, yes, then redeem the wallet funds. With that rant over, that's what's going on with PlayStation Stars. Moving on to our next story, how about another little rant coming up, which relates to the news about Sony making some changes on the PS Store and the PlayStation Plus category on the console, the sort of user experience, which they make a number of changes to this all the time. It's the same content, but just different ways to view it with genre breakdown, new panels, new menus to explore, things like that. I thought it was noteworthy to point out that it was really cool that they now added an Astro cameo section on the PS Store, which I thought was just really, really cool, right? Because if you're going through the game and maybe there's a lot of cameos you either do or do not know, but you just want to, maybe you're curious as to what kind of content is available right now in PS4, 5 that you can buy from those IP that appeared in the game, then that's a great handy way to do that. But what we're here to talk about is the changes they made to the PS Plus category under the Collections tab, where that's the where classics show up, right? PS1, PSP, PS2, PS3. Now they've got new panels separated out. They've got IP representing those panels, and so there's been some speculation as to why is Kratos showing up for the PS2 panel when there's no locally available God of War 1 or 2 games on the console right now. So some are speculating, especially with the recent God of War rumor that we had about the PSP and PS2 games, and also Ascension being repackaged and things like this. Here's what I'll add to this. I'm not even sure this is a rant, but like, you have to sort of know when to speculate and when we can maybe brush things off as, well, I'm not sure there's really much weight we can really add to that, right? Because we absolutely have circumstances where Sony themselves, whether this stuff showing up on the PSN backend or it does go live on the console for a brief moment where they sort of leak or show off upcoming IP or games that are going to show up on PS Plus. It's happened many times at this point. However, in this case, I mean, the company, and this is what in a way is frustrating, right? Because the way they categorize content on the store, there's no rhyme or reason to it. Case in point, if you go into the PS2 section, not only are all the PS2 games not actually there, but they're now throwing in the PlayStation 3 HD collections, which are native PS3 games that are not native on the console because you have to stream them. So the Ratchet and Clank games are in there now all of a sudden. But the Kratos, the God of War collection is showing up in the PS3 section where it should be, because technically they're streamed PS3 games, and that would... I guess it depends on how you look at it, right? You have to make a decision on where those games are going to be and then stay consistent. But the reality is they're not consistent, right? So it's I could make my peace with them all being in one category, and that's the decision they made. But when they're doing things like this, I'm not sure you can really sit here and go, oh, that's proof that God of War is coming. Even though I do find that eventually that's likely going to happen, which is possibly implicit conversions emulating the games, and that's how you get locally played God of War games on PS4, PS5. I still suspect that probably will happen, but in the case of Kratos showing up for the panel, it's like, well, they're already making really weird choices with their IP and how they categorize it. I don't really understand the rhyme or reason to it sometimes. Next up, let's go over some more updates for Astrobot, because even though you might be sick of this game, I am not, and I still am very happy to see the sales of this game doing quite well. What we'll first mention is that the second speedrun level is now live on PSN. The patch is sent out again every Thursday, so now we've got 2 available. It really is, in a way, eating away at me that I'm like, I'll wait until they're all out, but it's kind of tough watching my timeline fill with all these people going back and forth on the speed runs and trying to beat their times, and so it looks very fun. Still holding off, though. I'll probably wait till they're all out, and we'll probably film that and upload it on the channel. But as for the sales data, so we do have some metrics coming in from Matt Piscatella of Circana over on Blue Sky. Astrobot was, we now have the full September results here. So the second best-selling game for the month of September, ranked by dollar sales, only being beaten by EA Sports FC 25. Notable by dollar sales because Astro is a little bit cheaper than a lot of these $70 games out there. Also, I guess, kind of noteworthy is The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom was number 4, but Nintendo does not disclose digital sales data, so, in theory, maybe the game is fairly close to Echoes of Wisdom if we were able to see the full tracking for that game. But very happy to see that Astro is doing quite well in the United States, even more so than Europe, and Europe already was showing some very good results as well. So we'll just leave it there. Not going to spend too much time on Astro again, but it does seem as though the game is probably going to be, I would think, profitable for Sony. Dare I say, maybe very profitable, especially going into the holiday season and seeing how what kind of sales legs the game is going to have long term. Now, segueing nicely into our next news story, we also have some sales data for PS5 disc versus digital consoles, and also the physical versus digital split in the United States, which these are topics of interest on this channel. We have been following these very closely. As far as the console ratio goes, you know that we've been looking at this for the past 4 years, and there's always a lot of limited data, and from what I've heard, and this is still very limited, mind you, because it's going to be based on certain retail partners, the certain chain of command, and it's also a very big regional difference as well. But for about 3.5 years, the ratio that I've always heard was about 20 to 80, as in 20% is digital consoles being sold. Primarily, Sony is still selling, 80% physical disc PS5 consoles. But we did get some recent data from Christopher Dring of GamesIndustry.biz where that was now getting closer to 40-60, and now we're hearing that again from Matt Piscatella of Circana. So the same data here, he's putting this out there from every console being sold in September. About 40% of all those consoles were digital editions. But lifetime in the US, he did confirm that digital represents 18% of all PS5 hardware sales. So 82% lifetime in the US are disc consoles, which is actually very surprising because, I mean, that's close to 80-20, as I've said many times over, but that's always a number I've heard on just a general global scale. It could always be a little bit different. I would have thought at this point it would be a little bit past 20%, just given that more recent quarters, we've had a split now going like 40-60. And as far as like consoles actually go, like for Sony, they were losing money on the digital console for quite a while. The disc console started to make money fairly quickly, but this depends on when Sony decides to ever tell us these things with financial reports, but digital editions, they were losing money for quite a bit. And then that explains why the console saw a price increase even in the US from $400 to $450. But here's the thing, right? Even though Sony is still primarily selling disc consoles, and that does bode well, that still doesn't necessarily change that people will still be buying digital software for their disc consoles. So Matt also broke down that for January to August, tracking games that are both physical and digital, so excluding digital exclusive games, 53% of Switch games were digital compared to 52% last year. PS5 is now 78% digital versus 75% last year, and Xbox was 91% this year compared to 90% last year. Again, that data is from January to August of this year, showing that for two of these platforms, the digital adoption rate is slowing down. It's still favoring digital very slowly. PS5 saw a minor bump more so than the other platforms, but PS5 is still very digital in that sense. And it's what we've said many times over. Switch is about 50-50. PS5, and that's in the US, mind you, that's not global per se, but it's still a mostly digital machine, but that still represents a lot of physical software being sold, and Xbox has by far and away been the most digital for the three platform holders. The consumer habit there is just very different compared to the other two. But you know, that does show that consumers are mindful of having the option to use discs, because it is still a great thing to have, even if you do, say, always buy digital. But PS5 owners are still buying a lot of digital software. We got into that with our recent talk about physical games on PS5 and where the consumer habit is nowadays. Like, it depends greatly on the publisher. Like, PlayStation Studio games still sell a lot of physical software versus other games. So these are always fascinating metrics to look at, but it's always noteworthy when we do get that console breakdown, because it does illustrate some demand for using physical media. Even when it's not necessarily used as often, it's still the console that Sony sells the most, and it's still in their interest anyway, because it's a higher average spend per box when they're shipping these things out to retailers. Moving on to Monster Hunter Wilds, because this is one of the few games that actually does command enough interest to where Sony is going to actually make exclusive DualSense controllers and also console covers as well, which it still seems like they're just not really offering that many, you know, game edition, game specific console covers. And it seems even more weird during a cycle where we can take the covers off very easy, and so in theory you don't have to keep selling all these separate console bundles that has such a high minimum price tag. But I just wanted to throw that out there. They are Japan exclusive, which means you'll have to wait until, one, the game comes out. I don't think they're going to do pre-orders, I'm not entirely sure, but the game comes out February 28th, so that's when these will drop as well. So if you do want these, if you're looking at them thinking, damn, these look really good, going to have to probably use PlayAsia or other like third-party sites that will buy these things on your behalf, like I think Buyee does it and a few other places as well. But just one of those few examples where finally another exclusive console cover is out there. Also, if you are really interested in this game, I think you already know, but you can use your PS Plus subscription coming up for the open beta, which that starts on October 28th. Let's move on to Insomniac Games, which goes into a rumor from last week's episode about how we were hearing last minute that maybe some kind of announcement would happen at New York Comic Con relating to perhaps Marvel's Wolverine, which did not happen for that game. And so now the update there is that maybe we'll see some kind of announcement coming fairly soon, because again, that source is one that usually data mines or finds these things through back-end website scrapping. But the point is, we didn't have that happen. However, we did have some Marvel news pop up during the New York Comic Con panel, which was Marvel Spider-Man 2 is coming to PC on January 30th, being done by Nixxes Software again, so not too surprising there. They're not actually outlining anything in terms of what they're doing for this particular PC port, but you can probably expect what they've done prior for the other versions as well, and also the PS5 Pro enhancements, right? So we can already get a good idea of exactly what that's going to be. The real news here, though, is on the PlayStation blog where they were confirming this announcement, and this was also snuck in there by the senior community manager at Insomniac Games, Aaron Espinoza, where they do say there is no planned additional story content for Spider-Man 2. So some disappointing news for fans, especially because even before the Insomniac breach, we did see from the 2018 Spider-Man, they did have a number of content packs for the game. I think it was 3 for that as well, if I'm not mistaken. But the elephant in the room here is that we did have the Insomniac breach, and so while I usually cannot like display this stuff because I have to be very picky in terms of what does and does not get shown as far as like leaked or stolen material goes, but the one image that we had come out of there was that they did have this roadmap for 3 content items that they would do for the game over time, and that was well after the game's already been out, because all this content did not happen by that point. So that was already very outdated, and this is the problem with looking at that material. It can certainly be very interesting, but things change, of course, especially because that breach happened right before the company had some layoffs, and that goes back to the emails we got from the breach where we were tipped off that was potentially going to happen. The CEO, Ted Price, talking about how they're being pressured to make some cuts, and he was being very protective of either the Ratchet or the Wolverine team and having to move people around and lose valuable institutional knowledge. And so all that are variables at play as to what the company is choosing to do now. It's the same thing for the, spoiler alert here, but the other open secret is the Marvel's Venom game, which there's, that's sort of being moved around as well. And so we know about these things to some degree, but we're still not entirely clear as to what they're looking to do and how they're looking to release these things. And so one could probably safely conclude that those layoffs did play a role here, and their decision to maybe cut content, move content around, or move content into a bigger package for, say, Spider-Man 3. So that's sort of where we are with that, which has greatly upset a lot of fans. It's been a very big talking point, which is why we did a separate conversation on Tuesday about sequels on PlayStation 5 and how, a lot of folks are being vocal about how they're disappointed for those games. But as far as how this relates to Spider-Man 2 in particular, right? For me, I'm a little conflicted in that, like, I enjoyed Spider-Man 2. I liked the story a lot. I would say maybe the first one had a greater impact towards the end of the game, maybe had a bigger payoff, but 2 certainly has a through line that, also has some very big payoffs. And so I don't really... Now, this is maybe more of a habit thing, right? And I know I'm not the only one that feels this way when it comes to DLC for single-player games. A lot of people, and I've seen this come up a lot, which is like people don't like story DLC sometimes because they like finishing the game, being done with it, putting it down, moving on, and not wanting to go back to a previous game. They'd rather just wait for a sequel, and that's their new content to them. I'm somewhere in the middle here. Like, I don't mind story DLC at all, but it definitely like sort of hits me of like, oh, I got to go back to that game now. Not in a negative manner, but it's weird. Like, sometimes it's like a lower priority for me to go back and like clean up that content. Case in point, like I still haven't started God of War Ragnarok's Valhalla content. Still got to go back to the Burning Shores. I'm behind on Final Fantasy 16's DLC. These are all games I love dearly, and I think that content looks very, very good, but it's weird. Like, if a new entry came out for those games, I would be more inclined and excited to just go and play those games, right? It's a very weird sort of habit thing, right? If you're okay with story DLC and even want it, then this is going to be bad news to you. But I'm somewhere in the middle. I don't have a problem with story DLC, but I'm also completely fine if it does not happen. And if this is in the interest of just, obviously, we're going to see this stuff bigger and better in the next mainline entry, then that's not really a problem either. It really depends, I guess, where you sit on the whole thing with how you felt about Spider-Man 2. But, you know, that's where Insomniac is. I mean, that's the decision they made. I guess we have to respect it and wait for some updates for what we expect is going to be Marvel's Wolverine, which we'll hopefully see some stuff before the year closes out. All right, let's move on to some PlayStation 5 Pro news. This console is coming out very soon, about 2 weeks, which seems like it's coming up very fast, and because of that, we actually have some patches already live on PSN for a number of games, most notably The Last of Us Part 2 and also Stellar Blade. So I believe both those patches are now live on PSN for their PS5 Pro support. Stellar Blade is offering a high frame rate mode for 120Hz displays. I think that's new information. We might have heard that before, I don't know. What we did learn is that Lies of P's performance mode is now going to support a full native 4K. I don't think they're using PSSR because the performance mode prior, I think, was hovering around like 1500 to 1800p, so I think they're just going for full native 4K in their performance mode. And then Remedy also put out some comparison shots for Alan Wake 2, showing off the PS5 Pro's quality mode with ray traced reflections, and also the 60 FPS performance mode with increased visual fidelity. They actually posted a very thorough explanation on the blog, a really technical deep dive from the studio themselves, which is always really insightful and great to hear from the studio, rather than, say, you know, having Digital Foundry come in and obviously do good work, but have to make some guesses as far as like what the studio is doing. Always great to have the studio itself come out and explain their artistic decisions there. And as for our growing list of games, we are up to 74 total PS5 Pro enhanced titles, which is far more than we saw for PlayStation 4 Pro in the same time frame. It does appear as though there's a lot more developer adoption this time around versus what we saw in 2016. All right, moving on to some more Digital Foundry coverage for PlayStation 5 Pro. This time around, Alex Battaglia did a piece on PSSR and comparing it to other ML AI upscalers, or really one being NVIDIA DLSS, because AMD FSR 3.1 does not use AI, but it still is a reconstruction method that they're comparing it to, just as a sort of baseline comparison to, you know, get an idea of where PSSR really stacks up against these other options. And this was all done on PC with Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. Alex does make it very clear, obviously, that in terms of the testing conditions, they're not perfect. We have to consider the differences between console and PC and the kind of settings that are on PC versus what PS5 is set to. And so just that's something obviously to bear in mind. And as always, this full video is linked down below, but to summarize the results, compared to FSR 3.1, it does seem PSSR is off to a very strong start. One comparison does show PSSR not having any sort of that, you know, uneven motion fizzling that FSR produces when motion occurs from, say, Ratchet swinging his wrench, so you can see that very clearly. PSSR does seem to handle particle effects much better too, where these can have a more ghostly trail on FSR or disappear and reappear as FSR is trying to resolve a more clean image on them. PSSR is handling that a lot better, but compared to DLSS and also FSR, PSSR has an ever so slight fizzle or motion happening in a lot of scenes, where the other methods you can see the scenery is perfectly static. So if you like really look at the trees, for example, or foliage, there's just almost like a grainy noise filter on it in such a manner where you can see some ever so slight motion versus the static appearance on FSR or DLSS. Another downside is that moving geometry can have some rough edges or shimmer, whereas DLSS can retain a more smoother appearance, or at least one that's not nearly as obvious. So if you do sort of zoom in on these, you can see that it's more prominent and more exaggerated on the edges with PSSR. But I guess the conclusion here is that PSSR is somewhere in the middle, where it is pound for pound seemingly a lot better than what we're seeing with FSR 3.1, but DLSS is a lot more established. It's been around for many years. It's been trained over many years, and so that's the, I guess, potential upside to PSSR, is that it's a very impressive first showing on PlayStation 5 Pro, because again, we've said before, but it's like a matter of like, okay, you can very easily look at PS5 Pro right now, think it's too expensive, expensive, the differences are not worth it, but it can be a stepping stone to, PSSR being built and improved over time, and this could be maybe a very big improvement on PlayStation 6, right? So it's really fascinating to see what PSSR can do in this sort of 1.0 build, and over years of training, we could see some incredible differences on PlayStation 6, which maybe is more circumstantial too, knowing that like we're in diminishing returns. And so like the caveat I've always added is that, PS5 Pro, I'm not sure if they do that because they're going to eat away the sort of gains you could see with a PlayStation 6. If you add a stopgap console in there, that sort of lowers the value of what you might see potentially on PlayStation 6. But maybe that's not going to be the case if we can see PSSR mature in such a manner that PS6 will offer a pretty dramatic improvement, or at least more than we otherwise would have thought. Moving on to some Horizon news, and also more Digital Foundry coverage as well. It seems like Sony's really giving them a lot of access lately, which in cases like a remaster where you want to see comparisons, or PS5 Pro, that's really the one publication where that's where you'd want to give the access anyway, so good for them. So the news here is Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered. They had some coverage out for this game where they're able to really showcase all the visual differences in motion, real gameplay, and it's obviously one of those things where, as we discussed prior, very big differences. We already outlined a lot of the big stuff being the increase in foliage and draw distance and LODs and things like that, but now we can just see it properly with some true one-for-one benchmarks. We also learned that, like Forbidden West, on base consoles, mind you, you can choose between a 30 FPS fidelity mode or a 40 FPS mode or a 60 FPS performance mode, which if you play the 60 FPS mode on a 120 Hz display with VRR, then it actually unlocks the frame rate, which is good because that also future-proofs the game on later PlayStation platforms, which that is something we have to think about nowadays. It's oftentimes good that a game will offer an unlocked frame rate mode, but we do get a much thorough, closer look at the differences between the remaster and the original. So really the one big standout thing here, or really two I want to point out here, building interiors have much more accurate lighting, and also the foliage is like really green, really bright green, which I don't know, I guess it depends on where you're looking in the game. Sometimes it looks a little bit, I don't know if weird's the right word here, but it does sort of change the general art direction. I mean, Zero Dawn, in a lot of cases, depending on where you are in the game, it's just very red, almost Mexico feeling with, like, how Mexico's displayed in movies where there's that tone that they apply to it, a sepia tint to it. I don't know, it's just Horizon has a lot of areas like that, and now a lot of it's gone in the remaster, which I would say is more of a net positive. I think it would still look good in certain areas, but there's so many different biomes within Zero Dawn, so I don't think it's like safe to conclude that the game looks completely different. But it is interesting to note that with how much green foliage is in the game now, it does really change certain environments in a way that is sometimes better, and in some cases I would actually say maybe a little bit worse, but that's more of an art direction thing and not necessarily visual fidelity, because as far as fidelity goes, the game is far and above a massive improvement. Really, the thing I think is still the biggest improvement is those new mocap scenes where the characters aren't as stiff as they once were from the Zero Dawn original. I'll still stand by, like, Zero Dawn on PS4 is still a very pretty good looking game. It didn't necessarily need a remaster, but that is the one thing you go back and you're like, wow, even for 2017, that does feel a bit dated with how stiff the characters are compared to Forbidden West. Next up, let's talk about LEGO Horizon Adventures, because this game is also coming out very soon in November. We just had some final press previews go out for the game, which so far it seems like people are still generally enjoying the game, and it sounds like it might turn out as a very fun, sort of casual, family-friendly LEGO version of Horizon to play. But the news here is learning how the game actually came to be. So in a recent post from, the Washington Post, where Gene Park spoke with Kate Bryant, the project lead on LEGO branded games, we did learn that after the tall neck LEGO set, it was LEGO that wanted to do the game, and then Sony and Guerrilla agreed, and that's where Guerrilla then also teamed up with Studio Gobo to co-develop the title. So it does appear as though it was LEGO that initially pitched the game after the LEGO tall neck set. Which is always cool to hear how these things came to be, especially given the circumstances about this game, which is like, okay, cool, the LEGO set did happen, that was a really neat thing, but I don't think this was on anybody's radar to then get a full-blown Lego game with Horizon as the chosen property. So I would have thought like the connection was, and maybe it still is, a matter of like, oh, Michael Denny was the previous SVP of Worldwide Studios, and then he went to TT Games, and maybe that's how the Lego set initially kicked off, and that's how the merchandising thing happened. Then we had this stepping stone of Lego approaching PlayStation, and Sony's not going to say no to what might be a very lucrative deal, just in that they can get the Lego property, make a game out of it. I still think they were probably able to negotiate, okay, we'll do this, but no Xbox. So I'd be curious to learn more about what exactly went down there, because at least with modern exclusivity for PlayStation, it's only not Xbox, as in not the other guy. But yeah, it just seems like a sound idea. Just now we have more knowledge knowing that it sounds like Lego was the one that maybe got the ball rolling on this more so than Sony. Now, in the same Washington Post article, we also had a quote in there that was then cherry-picked out and made a lot of headlines this past week, sparking the conversation about Killzone, because the headline here is that Guerrilla is done with Killzone. So, again, speaking with Gene Park on the same article, we also heard from Guerrilla's art director, Roy Postma, where they talked about moving from Killzone to Horizon, where they said, and I quote here, "We were done with it, Killzone as a team. As a studio, we needed to refresh the palette. It was by choice the opposite of Killzone. I think the themes that the story and the characters represent are relatable for all ages and people, like having a found family of friends and finding your place in the world." So that is the quote right there. We were done with Killzone as a team, and that is not really new information whatsoever. It is one of those things where the context is that Gene was asking about the transition back at the time when they moved from Killzone to Horizon. It's not him asking, fresh off the bat with all the Horizon stuff going on, what about Killzone? Is more Killzone coming? It was about that older transition that already took place years ago, which we know that is where Guerrilla is nowadays. They're doing Horizon, a lot of new stuff with that franchise, and we have not had a Killzone game in 10 years on PS Vita from Guerrilla Cambridge, or 11 years from Guerrilla proper on PlayStation 4 with Shadowfall. There is no new information in here. However, it does still spark that conversation of Killzone is a property now that's old enough to where there's a lot of fond memories. People are looking back on that IP, and it was still very different considering it's, nowadays a genre that Sony is underrepresented on, which is a sci-fi first-person shooter. Granted, Concord was certainly an attempt in that area, but I digress. The point is, Killzone is still a very unique feeling game, because I really enjoyed Killzone. I love that franchise a lot. It has that very heavy weighted feel where the bullets just, they have a sort of impact and connection with the enemies when you're shooting, and even though they kind of lighten that up with Shadowfall, but also I really enjoyed Shadowfall's class system as well. But I mean, there's so many things I could gush and love and go on about Killzone as a franchise. I really love those games a lot, but I think most people nowadays are also fairly in agreement. Like, we all know this, which is Horizon has sold a lot better, but it's not even so much Horizon, right? It's just that Killzone, as it stands by itself, was not really that strong of a property relative to a lot of other things, right? I mean, we didn't even get remasters for those games on PlayStation 4. So, I mean, it's one of those things where it's an older IP that Sony owns that is probably going to be shelved for an indefinite amount of time, probably for, I don't want to say forever, but it's one of those things where it's like we might not see it for a really long time if they ever do humor the idea of going back to it, remastering those games, doing something with them, maybe even licensing them out, because that's the other obvious aspect. I think people understand that it's not going to be Guerrilla doing Killzone again, but why not give it to somebody else? But the thing is, like, that is a viable option, and I would like to see that happen for a lot of older PlayStation IP, and I would prefer that in the context of, like, let's just get these games ported over to PS4 5. I don't necessarily need new entries for all these old PlayStation IP, but I would absolutely advocate for getting some of the, stuff that's stuck on PlayStation 3 and getting it brought up to a modern audience for the older titles. Let's get legacy support going, because if anything, that's what needs to happen first before going into the idea of let's do a brand new entry, maybe a new reboot, maybe a remake, which all these things are going to be financially a lot more risky than just doing ports, and those are financial stepping stones to gauge interest, and maybe that's where a conclusion can be drawn on if the IP should be brought back in any sort of larger, meaningful way. And as far as Killzone is concerned, coming from a Killzone fan, like, this is one I could see just sitting for a long time. It's just the reality of it. I mean, there are some I feel more strongly about it having a better shot at returning and returning in a very big way, and others not so much. It does pain me to say, but like Killzone, it's going to be left alone for probably a long time. That's where I sit on the whole thing, and clearly Guerrilla feels the same way, Sony feels the same way. It doesn't feel good to say that, but Killzone just never really became the sort of big blockbuster IP that anybody would have hoped it to be. Moving on to our final Horizon story here, we do have a brief update on what's going on with the character Sylens in the Horizon universe, because, as we all know, the actor that played Sylens, Lance Reddick, passed away last year, and so now we know what Guerrilla is planning on doing. When speaking with IGN, we have Guerrilla's senior world artist, Lucas Bolt, where they said, and I quote here, "Lance Reddick tragically passed away in 2023, and he is deeply missed within Guerrilla and our community. He wonderfully portrayed the essential character Sylens in Horizon Zero Dawn and Forbidden West. The character of Sylens does appear in LEGO Horizon Adventures, and we will introduce the new actor at a later date." This probably was unavoidable, given that there are times where, in respect of the actor and their performance and what they meant for the character, the storyline and the plot will change, and they'll be written out, or they can be reused right up to a point where then they can some way have some closure in the game, or any sort of media, obviously. But in some cases, it's really hard to do. So with Forbidden West, where Sylens plays a very big, critical role in the game, and he's also just a deeply fascinating, if not frustrating character in a way, which Lance played amazingly, right? That's the whole point. It would be hard to not have Lance then, or rather the character Sylens, be a part of Horizon 3's storyline. So I can't say I'm really too surprised by this info, but we now know that there will be a new actor stepping in, which excited to see who's going to fit into the new role. And it will be, I will say it'll be tough, given that it's also such a very unique voice and sort of candor. But I'm still excited to see who can carry on Lance's legacy for the character of Sylens. Alright, moving on to a very minor but still notable description of Naughty Dog's next game, where this is coming from the MinMax show. Ben Hansen, speaking on a recent episode, was describing this, and so he was, touching on Naughty Dog's next game, and this really generated a lot of headlines where this is according to somebody very in the know who worked on the game, but Ben said, and I quote here, "The tone was like, you are all not ready for how amazing this thing is going to be." And the tone was, I'm not going to say the game that they referenced to compare it to, because I don't want people to be like, MinMax said it was going to be exactly like this, but they compared it to a game with a lot of player freedom. So Ben, of course, being very careful with his words, more of a CYA situation, covering what he says. And it's funny, too, because Ben does not really, he'll hear and he knows things, absolutely, but he doesn't often put out even a very brief description like this. So I'm inclined to say that I'm sure he's being genuine with who he talked to and what he had heard about the game, which that slight descriptor I think is a very exciting prospect, given Naughty Dog with what they've typically done, which are primarily linear games. Very linear in that it's one straight path. You can't really deviate too much. We have seen in more recent games like The Last of Us Part 2, most notably, where there's a lot of these semi-open areas, which was even more so than Uncharted 4, which had a lot of pretty big combat arenas. But it sounds like they maybe want to go outside of their comfort zone here. I would think. That's sort of what it's reading to me, if there is some sort of game being compared and referenced, and Ben's not going to outline that, but it sounds like it might be, an open world game, maybe a FromSoft title. I think that was Neil Druckmann that said, a lot of FromSoft games, which the entire industry has been very clear about this, like a lot of directors and folks that have played recent FromSoft stuff, like that influence is already being felt, and since games take so long to make, and that kind of goes into this methodology long term for the games that we see in the next 5-10 years, that's what might creep into other more established big teams. So I almost feel like it probably was a FromSoft game, but to see that from Naughty Dog, I think, would be a really cool thing, especially knowing how Naughty Dog can approach certain games with their Naughty Dog attention to detail. So, and it still reads to me like it's the new IP first, and then The Last of Us Part 3 after that. It's still a shame that Naughty Dog is probably very far away with this next title, but I'm still inclined to say we might see it sooner rather than later. It may not be nearly as long as some people are thinking. Next up, let's talk about some PlayStation Live Service news, where it actually has been quite a bit since we had a story like this. But we are hearing from a former lead at Bungie, or I guess not really former per se, but Bridget O'Neill. She has confirmed that she's taking on a new role as Senior Director of Creative at PlayStation Studios. She says Bungie Creative Studios is joining PlayStation to build the foundation for a creative team that can support all PlayStation Live Service games. Now, the actual news here, I think, is maybe more... I'm surprised that it maybe took this long, although it really depends on what the timeline was supposed to be. We saw from the business segment briefing in 2022 that there was a very structured sort of integration plan for Bungie when the acquisition process was still going on, when it was expected to close, and there was like a three-phase, plan in place with how Bungie was going to integrate with PS Studios and how they were going to start reviewing their portfolio and establish also this completely separate division, which would then be a sort of tool set and operational arm for PlayStation Live Service games. I would have thought that would have been established and already done and set up by now, and that's even disregarding all the obvious sort of turmoil that Bungie went through and Sony stepping in to take over financials in the company and all that jazz. And maybe that was actually what was a problem here with now establishing this separate division, but it sounds like they're still in the process of doing that right now. So that's where we're at. It's not really I guess alarming news, because we knew this was going to happen, just that I thought it would have already been further along than where we are right now. But Sony is still very committed to doing live service games, and this still is in the interest of supporting those games, learning from their mistakes, which they've already seen plenty of them now at this point. So if there's any sort of positive spin we can place on live service news and some of the failures Sony's had, it's that the company is going to learn from them, and it's a matter of learning, I guess, taking those learnings and applying them for the better and not for the worse. Moving on to the SAG AFTRA video game strike, where that's still been going on since late July, because they're still fighting for AI protections for their unioned actors in the community. And so right now we do have an update going on where they began negotiations again just yesterday, but this entire way through they've actually been collecting new agreements, either to their interim video game agreement or also a tiered budget agreement. They're up to 120 games across 49 different companies. We have SAG AFTRA's National Executive Director and Chief Negotiator, Duncan Crabtree Ireland, where they said, and I quote here, "As we return to negotiations tomorrow, I hope we are able to reach an agreement on our interactive media agreement. But if not, we will keep on working with the companies that are prepared to agree to fair, ethical, and responsible contract terms, including for the use of artificial intelligence." Because this still is the primary issue that is going on within the acting community, which is protections against AI, as all these contracts are getting ready to be renewed, and that's why they went on strike, because clearly there is some friction on publishers and game studios maybe wanting to use AI more in a manner that's beneficial to them and their bottom line, and that's not in the interest of the voice talent and the actors for these games. So it sounds like they do have a number of sort of, studio by studio agreements in place, but there's still no sort of broad agreement and contract that's been secured just yet. So that's the latest update on what's going on with the SAG AFTRA video game strike. Moving on to PlayStation Productions news, we have a very small update for the God of War Amazon Prime TV series. We saw last week that the showrunner, or multiple showrunners, executive producers, left the project. We've already got a replacement. That being Ronald D. Moore. He is the new showrunner. He's also tapped for writing, doing the script, executive producer. He is the replacement right now. So I guess that illustrates the point I was talking about last week, which is I can't see how they would not want to make sure this thing actually does get done. Sounds like that's much quicker progress than what the Horizon Netflix series is going through, because I don't think there's like any update on that, right? It's still kind of like completely in limbo. So at least for now, I think we can probably say that God of War is still very much on the way, just far away. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or X, and if you'd like to win a $10 PSN code, it is so simple. Follow the link down below, enter the Gleam giveaway, and supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week, because I'm trying to help pay for your games. those are some of the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all. And our Tuesday video was talking about PS5's big sequels, the high-profile ones like your Ragnarok, Spider-Man 2, Forbidden West. There's been a lot of conversation around these games and how they maybe did not live up to expectations, so we talk about what's going on there. And then Wednesday we looked at the activity card system, how with the 10.0 update and also 10.20, it seems like Sony very much did turn off the one function where they're able to skip splash screens, logos, things like that, if the game did support it at the time. So we look into what's going on there. And then coming up, it might be another 2-upload week. It might end up being like another Tuesday, Wednesday kind of thing. I'd like to do them on Sundays, then Tuesday, but it never really works out that way as far as like editing goes. So it might be like a Tuesday, Wednesday kind of thing. And I think we also have another Click R3 coming up as well. Have to check in with John on that. But otherwise, that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.